at the first 4 verses. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. That sounds pretty serious stuff, doesn't it? Well, we were here in this 12th chapter just for a few moments in verses 12 through 15 at the conclusion of my last lesson. But today what I want to do is I want to deal with the context in which we find, which leads up to, and of course on beyond, verses 12 through 15. Again, we'll touch on those at the end of this message again today. But here in these first 4 verses, and particularly in this first verse, you know, we find here an admonition that I'm sure that you're very familiar with if you've been in church anywhere in your life. An admonition that has a common expression that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. But what I want to do today is kind of enlarge upon that, you know. But here's the admonition that we mostly have had, and I'm not saying that it's not appropriate, but here's the admonition that most of us have received from verse 1 in particular, that we need to set aside, lay aside those personal disgusting habits, you know, and those horrible behavioral traits that so easily ensnare us and keep us from having, you know, from progressing in our discipleship. And again, you know, I'm not trying to do away with that whole concept of our disgusting habits and our, you know, personal behavior traits and things. I think there's validity to that. I'm certainly, you know, well seasoned in my own sin, well enough seasoned in my own sin consciousness that I realize there's validity to that idea. You know, that there are some things in my life that it had been beneficial for me to set them aside, lay them aside, get rid of them, in order to allow me to progress. Primarily progress outside of the realm of condemnation, which is the realm in which I lived for most of my Christian life, you know, always self-condemned about the things that went on in my life. And of course, I didn't understand it as self-condemnation. I thought it was the condemnation of my Creator, of my Maker, trying to straighten me up, trying to help me learn to lay aside those things which so easily beset me, as the King James says, you know. So anyway, as I said, we're not going to throw that out, but but when we read the larger passage here, reading this larger passage that we're going to look at today, you know, it reveals a much broader meaning. A more specific idea is trying to be communicated here by the author of Hebrews. And again, you know, you can go ahead and hang on to that old idea, and you can say, well, yeah, there certainly is benefit many times in setting aside some of the things that trip me up in life and keep me under self-condemnation and all that. But really and truly, folks, that's not what this passage is about, even though it's been presented like that to us, even though verse 1 has been taken out of context many times to kind of bring us back into the control that we need to be under, that somebody thinks we need to be under, okay? So anyway, but this is speaking more specifically, as we're going to see today, speaking more specifically to a greater ensnaring, entangling problem that we have here. Now, listen to it carefully as we just look at these words again. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Or I'm going to say it this way, which so easily reduces our influence to nothing. And you're going to see that that's really the implication here. It's not so much the implication of you and I stumbling up because of our behavior issues and not being effective with regard to overcoming those things in our own life, and which is all valuable stuff. I agree with all of that. However, what's being spoken to here is a greater thing. It has a much more specific function, as you'll see in the context of Hebrews chapter 12 today. And it really has to do with those things which reduce our influence to nothing. And of course, that's really one of the things I've been trying to emphasize in this whole message on forgiveness. You know, as I said to you last week, I think Jesus had a world vision, not just a local personal vision when he said, "Peace be unto you if you forgive the sins of any." I think that Jesus wanted us to expand that understanding and not just focus on the fact that, hey, I could have peace in my own little home down the street here by just forgiving, but that forgiveness would actually have an influence on the world around me. And see, that's what we're talking about now, is we're talking about having an influence on the situations, the conditions, the affairs of this world, not just within the sphere of our influence, but reaching outside that sphere into the world beyond and beginning to see some actual change take place in the world that we seem to be so critical of and have reason to be critical of so many of the things going on outside. But anyway, so again, let's look at this again. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily reduces our influence to nothing. Here's what I'd like you to notice first of all, the words the sin. That's very specific. That's a very specific article, the sin. Not the sins, it's not plural. It said, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. So here's what we have here. We have every weight, which refers or indicates many, right? Every weight indicates many, but the sin indicates one, something in particular, something that really is, what I want to say, qualifies as being called the sin. All right, now, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer you an oversight of this passage before we actually work through it today, because I think it will help you more easily see what's actually being said here. In other words, I'm not trying to put thoughts before you, but what I'm going to do is say that which I know you will see, because it's what's here. I'm not trying to read something into this. I'm not going to try to say, this is what it says, and now you're going to help me find that in here, okay? I'm going to just say something beforehand. I mean, because we preachers do that. We want you to see something, so we tell you beforehand what you're going to see, and lo and behold, you see that when we're done. And then later on, you sit under some other preacher who didn't see it that way, okay? So I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to make you see something, but I do want to give you a heads up, I think, a little bit on this. So let me tell you what this passage is about, okay, as we go. Every weight, remember we said refers to every weight, which means many. Every weight refers in this passage to the transgressions of others against us. And the sin that so easily ensnares us is the sin of retaliation and vengeance and violence, or we can use a simple word, unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is the sin which so easily entangles us. And again, you're going to see that in this. I mean, you'll see it because it's right there. We just haven't read this thing in context, and we've had some verses that I'm going to refer to in a little bit too. Later on in this chapter, talking about the chastisement of God, the discipline of the Lord, that have been so badly distorted in their presentation to us, that this chapter is all broken up. That's one of the things I've discovered, particularly in the book of Hebrews, is how broken up it has been in its selection of scriptures. We take this one out that says, that if you've fallen away, you can't be restored again, and we've turned that into something that it's not. They do that a lot with the book of Hebrews. But as we look at this, we're going to see that this really flows really well and begins with an admonition to help us realize that every weight has to do with the transgressions of others against us, and the sin has to do with our tendency and our response to retaliate, to desire retribution, to execute retribution, to look for vengeance for the things that have been done wrong to us. So just bear with me. We'll go through this, and you'll see that that's what this is really all about. Now, sadly, unforgiveness, church, is what we do best. Do you know that? Unforgiveness is what we do best. We make more excuses. Now, I've been a pastor for the better part of the last 40 years, not that whole time, but and I can tell you that, and it's true of me as well, certainly, but I have heard more excuses for why we can't forgive. We make more excuses for our unforgiveness than we do for our own transgressions. See, we spend more time justifying our unforgiveness is what I'm saying, It's sad, but that's the way it is. So unforgiveness is what we do best. Well, but you just don't understand. See? But Mike, you don't realize what, or I say, but Marilyn, you don't. I mean, we're all the same. And so unforgiveness is what we've learned to do best down through the years. We're really good at it. We excel at it in the church. The whole world does, but the church ought not to excel at it. The church ought to excel at forgiving the sins of any, retaining the sins of none. But we have not yet come to that, and we'll see that that is one of the things that we're being chastised about here in this particular passage of Scripture today, all right? So we judge, we condemn, we bear grudges, and we verbalize our desire for vindication, for retribution. And we say ugly things sometimes. I just said an ugly thing yesterday, see, about somebody who was withholding opportunity from my granddaughter. See, so I verbalized the very thing that I already knew I was going to be preaching on. It was just so that you'd have an example. I didn't do it for any other reason. I just wanted you to have an example of what I'm talking about. I'm sure none of you could come up with one. So I've said something, and my wife says, "My goodness, Mike, you said that?" Well, it was just for an example for the people tomorrow, honey. I wanted to make sure I got it out. No. See, but we do that, So as I said, we bear grudges and we do all of these things. And we express our retaliatory, vindictive, retributive desires for people, for nations, for systems, for all kinds of things. And again, I just want to keep putting this in as we go through that. This is destroying us from the inside out. It really isn't hurting them in the one degree. Of course, it is in the other hand, because we're not doing anything to help them become who they can become. So now let's bring this into clarity using the Scripture. And as I said, if you don't see what I've already said this means, then, apparently I've missed the boat. But as I said, I'm not trying to tell you what this says. I want you to see it. But I thought if I gave you an oversight of it first, every weight has to do with the transgressions of others against us. The sin has to do with our unforgiveness. We'll just keep it that way. And whatever kind of retaliatory or get-evenness that we imagine and hope will happen to those who sin against us, right? All right, back to verse 1. Let us run with endurance the race set before us. Now, the first thing I want you to do here as we get into this is I want you to notice the language or the phrase that he's used here. Let us run with endurance the race set before us, right? We all know that. We've heard it a million times probably. But then, going forward then, the author in verse 2 uses identical language regarding Jesus. Now notice what it says in verse 2. Looking to Jesus, which just simply means, taking our example from Jesus, looking to Jesus, who let me just change it slightly, who for the race set before him. Now he recognized, first of all, his race to be a race that had joy. It was for the joy. But we're just going to use the word race here because I want you to see that the author is communicating through identical language something for us. He's saying, I want you to look to Jesus for your example. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking to Jesus, taking our example from Jesus, right? Who for the joy or the race that was set before him endured. Same word as endured in verse 1. So we have the word endured, exact same word, same meaning in both verses, okay? Who for the joy now was set before him endured. And what did he endure? The cross, right? And then he goes on into verse 3 here, and he says this, if you'll allow me to just slightly paraphrase the beginning. Let me be clear about my meaning of the previous verse. Say, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Let me be clear about my meaning, he says. Consider him who endured, same word again, such hostility, now listen, from sinners against himself. Now, do you see how, first of all, he is using this, verses 2 and 3 here, tying it back to verse 1, telling us how to run our race with endurance, the race that is set before us with endurance, how he's using this to bring into light what it means to lay aside every weight and the sin, see, which so easily ensnared us. All right? He says, this is how you're going to do it. Let us run with endurance, the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, who for the joy set before him, as our race was set before us, endured, same word, the cross. Now let me clarify what I mean, he goes on to say. Consider him who endured, again, such hostility from what? Sinners against himself. See how he's focusing on that? Now the word such here is an interesting word. This word such here is a word that means the same kind of. It's a word that means, as you have been enduring hostility, as you have been experiencing hostility against yourself, Jesus likewise. That's what the word such means, okay? Him. All right. So what's this about? If you think about what's this about now, this is about the hostility of others against himself. All right? That's what he's brought it all down to. Looking to Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Say, consider him, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. That's what this is about, isn't it? That's what verse 2 was about, who endured the cross. What was the cross? The hostility of sinners against the incarnate God, right? Okay. So that's what verse 1 was calling every weight. Remember, notice that hostilities is plural, weight is many, right? So he endured, as it says, such hostility from sinners against himself. Wow. Okay. And our race, then, he's saying here, is to be run as his race was run. We're to take our example from him. We're to consider him. What this also says is that our race is to be run as he ran his, for the joy set before us, not being deterred in our race by retaining the sins of others. See, the message here is that Jesus did not retain the sins of others. Instead, he bore the sins of others, didn't he? We know that. He bore the sins of others. But we're telling it that we're to run the race the same way. So he says, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners, or we could say it this way, when you're confronted with the hostilities of others, consider him. That makes sense, right? And then he says, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Now you see how he has taken verses 2 and the major part of verse 3, and he has bookended that with, let us, say, run with endurance, the race that is set before us, laying aside every weight, and the sin which so easily ensnares us. And then you can jump right down to the bottom of verse 4, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. See, so we have sandwiched together the example of Jesus, the way Jesus ran his race, and the way Jesus ran his race was by enduring the hostility of sinners against himself, which ultimately led to the cross, right? You see what I'm saying? But this is about how we are going to respond to the world in which we live, see, as a result of what he has done. And so he said, lest you, starts out with let us, now he's down here to lest you, see, become weary and discouraged in your souls. Now, weary and discouraged in your souls describes you and I when we retain the sins of others. Because retaining sins does what? It gives the mastery or the power over the transgressions of others. Get it right. It gives the transgressions of others, I should say, the mastery and the power over our what? Our peace. And we become weary and discouraged in our souls. Now, we may put on a religious face. How you doing, brother? Oh, the joy of the Lord is my strength. Well, for the joy set before you, do you endure the hostility of sinners against yourself? For the opportunity to forgive and actually see that forgiveness begin to produce change? Well, I wouldn't go that far, brother. You don't know what they did to me. See what I'm saying? All right, you're getting it. I can tell because you're quiet. Okay. Now, let's go on to verse 4. So as I said, when we retain the sins of others, or when we, have retaliatory, vengeful desires, if not actions, towards the others, then what really ultimately happens is we become weary and discouraged in our soul. And then we go into verse 4. You have not, see, it's still about us. Still about us. It's only about Jesus to the degree that Jesus is to be our example and our consideration when we are confronted with the hostilities, the transgressions of sinners against ourselves. See, those that we've decided are sinners. Okay? Now, he said, you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. Now, this has to remain in context, okay? We can't just start jerking things out of context. It has to remain in context. And so, resisted to bloodshed has to be synonymous with endured the cross, endured such hostility, right? In other words, he resisted something and endured the cross. He resisted something, right? And endured in enduring such hostility. So in other words, here in this passage, resistance and endurance are equal. His resistance equals his endurance. Still building my case, okay? So in other words, first thing we need to realize, and we know this, his resistance was not against the hostility, right? As we're going to see in a minute. I mean, we heard the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, right? We're going to see the passage that alludes to that in a minute. So his resistance was not against hostility, was it? He's resisting something else, something that's appears at first to be hidden in this passage, but it's very evident. His resistance was not against the hostilities, like mine would be, right? Like we're prone to be. You get hostile with me, you're going to meet some resistance. That's kind of the way we think, isn't it? Okay. And consequently, striving against sin, is not a call to arms. It's not his approval for us to take retaliatory measures. Striving against sin is not throwing rocks with scriptures wrapped around them through the abortion clinic window. Striving against sin is not writing the hateful things we write on Facebook about others or situations or governments. Now, I'm not talking about, as I said several weeks ago, we're not talking about ignoring or not acknowledging the things around us that are wrong. I'm talking about how we respond to those things. Jesus and the Father and the Spirit have offered us a vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. We talked about vengeance a long time ago, right? Did I just go off? Am I still on? Okay, I thought it went off all of a sudden. Anyway, I don't want to go off. I don't want you to miss any of this. Now, so as I said, it's not striving against sin, is not. And so he says, you have not yet resisted, or what's that mean? Endured, right? Let me get it in here in a minute. To bloodshed. You have not resisted to bloodshed, not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. I used to take such pleasure in getting arrested for striving against abortion. See what I'm saying? Now, am I against abortion? Absolutely, 100%. I'm not in agreement with it at all, But here's what I'm saying is, my action towards that, got me in trouble with the law just once. But it excited me because I saw myself as striving against sin, letting the world know that my Jesus was against that. See? But that's not what this means. That's sometimes what we think it means. We think it's a call to arms. We think it's his approval for retaliatory, retributive action to be taken on our part. All right? In the context of enduring such hostility from sinners, I think maybe what we ought to do is allow the Apostle Peter to butt into our conversation here for just a moment, because, as we'll see again here in just a second, Peter learned kind of a embarrassing lesson, if you will, after having been with Jesus for several years. But here's what Peter had to say after the fact. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return, right? When he suffered, he did not threaten. That's 1 Peter 2:22. You say, very astute, Peter. Where'd you pick that up? You're a quick learner, right? Well, go with me. Just keep your hand here and go with me over to Matthew chapter 26. Verse 51. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus. Now, we know from the Gospel of John that this to be Peter, but I chose this one because it has more to say, a bigger passage than John did to our message today. And suddenly one of those, Peter, with Jesus, stretched out his hand, drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. Jesus said, put your sword in its place, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. He could have just said, all who take up retribution will perish by retribution, or violence is violence, or, retaliation. He could have just used any of those words, but Peter drew a sword, okay? So Peter gave, a material witness to this thing. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? See? Oh, now, Peter learned from that. Peter realized that the response of Jesus in enduring such hostility against himself from sinners was not to take up retaliation and vengeance, was not to call upon the 10,000 angels, was not to say, I need some help, we're going to get even. All right, going back over now to Hebrews 12:4. So again, we're talking about you have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against sin, which is another way of saying he did, the one you're to look to, the one you're to consider, but you haven't, right? So this is still part of the initial admonition of this particular chapter. You have not yet. He has, but you have not yet. You call yourselves disciples, but you are not yet following in his footsteps. You are not yet allowing his work to be reflected through you in your life. You have not yet, say. So his striving against sin is in reference to the sin that so easily entangles us. Now remember, we got to keep this in context. What did he tell us to do? Lay aside every weight and the sin. And he's still addressing that right here. He's addressing that through these first several verses. He's saying, let us lay aside every weight and the sin. So when we get to verse 4 and it talks about his striving unto bloodshed against sin, or, enduring, whatever, resisting unto bloodshed against sin, his striving against sin is referring to the sin that this passage is all about. The sin. Okay? And so striving against sin means the same thing for us that it did for him. In other words, striving against or resisting the urge, the desire to retaliate, to execute vengeance, to administer retribution. See, that's what his striving against sin was. Certainly Jesus was tempted. He was in all things tempted as we are, yet without sin. Certainly he was tempted to retaliate. He surely could have saved himself. One thief said he couldn't, but he surely could have. He surely could have called 10,000 angels. He could have, but he didn't. Right? That was all part of his striving against sin. Striving against the temptation to say, man, enough is enough. His striving against sin was him saying, look, I saw the movie, The Passion of the Christ. I ain't going through that. That ain't going to be me. See? No, his striving against sin was exactly what we're talking about. Striving against, not only, in his case, not only the desire, but knowing he possessed the ability. The only ability we would possess would be evil ability, lawless ability. All right? And so 1 Peter 2:21, the previous verse to what I read a while ago, says this, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his footsteps. Is he saying to me that I should resist even unto bloodshed in striving against the sin? Well, I hate to say that, you comfortable American people. Could very well be. See? And verse 4 is actually saying Jesus died rather than to retaliate in response to the hostility of sinners against himself. Now, did you see in that, and we're not done yet, but did you see so far in that what I wanted you to see? What I told you was actually there? I mean, did you see it yourself? Or are you just being manipulated by my classy presentation? I don't want you to be manipulated at all, but I want you to see this. All right? So now, with what we've discovered, with what we believe we've seen in this initial admonition here in the first 4 verses, now we should be able to read the next 7 verses and get from these next 7 verses something that we've never gotten before, because the next 7 verses have been used to postulate all manner of crap about the chastisement of the Lord. So let's just begin to read in verse 5. And, remember, you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin, which is part of the first 4 verses, and, which means we're still talking about the same thing, right? We're not changing and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as it seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Wow. Isn't that something? No chastening seems to be joyful for the present. And as I talked to you about those first 4 verses, it was not pleasurable to many of us. The things that I was suggesting, the things that we have not yet resisted unto bloodshed in striving against sin. I don't like that. I don't like sin being defined as my unforgiveness, the sin. That just brings it right down to where it's hard to get around it. If my sin is adultery, I might find a way around that one. Well, no, but you can't do that with unforgiveness, see? All right? So here's the thing. As I said, all kinds of ridiculous things have been taught, postulated about the chastening of God, taking those 7 verses out of context and saying, well, you know, the death of that child, that was the chastening of the Lord. Or that automobile accident, or the death of your business, or the failure of your finances, whatever that, all of those things have been talked about. But listen, taken in context, and it must remain in context, okay? It can't be taken out of context. Taken in context, okay? The implication here is, now listen to me carefully, that the correction that is being given to us in verses 1 through 4 is the chastening of the Lord. He's saying, now listen, he's telling us, he's giving us this admonition, and he's saying, now don't be discouraged. This is the chastening of the Lord. When the Lord says you have not yet resisted the bloodshed, don't hang your head and be discouraged. Just realize this is the chastening or the correction or the discipline of the Lord. He's trying to communicate to his offspring, to the redeemed of the Lord, say, a better way to live. The chastening of the Lord is mentioned 6 times here. Well, one time it's used the word correction. Chastening is in verse 5, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 9 is correction, verse 10, and verse 11. So what he's telling us is that we are to understand that the first 4 verses are the chastening or the discipline or the what? The correction of the Lord. Correcting the way we respond to the transgressions of others against us. You have not yet. He did. I just told you about it in verse 2 and 3, but you have not yet. See, that's being corrected. That's being chastened. Does that make sense to you? That's the discipline of the Lord, not somebody losing a leg or a child or their house or their business or this, that, or the other thing. That's not the chastening of the Lord. The chastening of the Lord is his correcting us, see, in this whole matter. So he said, you have not yet. You have not yet. You have not yet. See, that's correction. You have not yet cleaned your room. You have not yet, whatever, see. There's a correction, a chastening that's being offered here by the Lord. You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against your own desire for vindication and retaliation. The sin which so easily entangles us. That's what he's saying. That's the chastening of the Lord. That's correction from the Lord, see? Regarding what? Regarding the hostility of others against us, okay? And this chastening is in order of verse 9, that we might live, verse 10, that we might profit, also verse 10, that we might partake of his holiness, ultimately experiencing, the peaceable fruit of righteousness, verse 11. So he's just telling you, this is why I'm offering you this admonition. This is why I am giving you this correction, because I want you to live. Peace be with you if you forgive the sins of any. Right? I want you to not only live, but I want you to profit. That doesn't mean dollars and cents. It just means I want your life to be profitable. Yeah. I want it to be enjoyable. Yeah. He goes on, he said, what else did I point out there? That you may partake of his holiness, and that you may ultimately experience the peaceable fruit of righteousness. See, it's all for your benefit. This admonition, this chastening, this discipline. See, it's proof that the Father loves us, that he would tell us, you have not yet. Look to Jesus. Consider him. And consider the influence of his life upon humanity. I want your influence to be equal as the body of Christ. I want you to reflect my Son for everybody's benefit. All right, now let's go on to verses 12 to 15 again, where we were last week. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Now the word therefore in verse 12 actually ties us back to the end of verse 4. See? You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against sin. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and so on. Here's what you need to understand here. Therefore, understanding the admonition of verses 1 to 4 to be the chastening of the Lord, strengthen the hands that hang down, and so on. Now, I hope you can see in this the Father's concern for our wholeness, for our completeness. There's been some people say, I wish Mike could get back to preaching on healing and some of that fun stuff. Listen, I am preaching on healing. I'm preaching on wholeness and healing and health and well-being at depths we have not plumbed before. And that's part of the problem. That's what I said, a big problem. This isn't, healing is always, well, he goes on, he says some things here. Let's read it. Well, I read those two verses. But see, that's the point of the Lord's admonition in verses 1 through 4, that we would rather be healed. Notice that he said in that last verse, but rather be healed. And verses 1 to 4 are given to us, that admonition is given, hoping, the Father hoping, that we would rather be healed than persist in our insistence upon retaliation and vengeance and unforgiveness and violence and so on and so forth. Now, we will, as I've already said, we're really good at making excuses for our unforgiveness. And I'm not just talking about on the husband-wife level. I'm not just talking about within the family, within the extended family, within the church, within I'm talking about with regard to the entirety of the cosmos, which he came to redeem. We have our excuses on why we must respond a certain way under certain conditions and situations. Now, I'm not telling you how to respond. You respond any way you want to respond, but you see, what we need to understand is God is offering us an alternative. And you know what? You say, well, but it's so slow, and the implications of it are just so long. Of course they are, because the church has screwed around for 2,000 years, not yet resisting unto bloodshed in striving against sin. Not that bloodshed would be necessary, but just saying, you know what? I'm going to refuse to be that way. I'm going to be like him who for the joy set before him endured the cross, right? I'm going to be like him. I'm going to believe that there is a joy in my setting aside the sin which so easily entangles me. That it's unto joy. But nobody does that. So how could things get better? How can they get better if all we do is keep going with the status quo? God has offered us a way to reduce. As I said last week, we keep expressing all of our discontent with the way things are. We put it on Facebook, we shout it, we throw stones, we do all of these things as Christians. What we're doing is saying we don't agree with the status quo, but yet we keep on enabling the status quo by not beginning to do the one thing that God said has the really potential and the ability to change it all eventually. But we don't like eventually. I want now. And now the thing that makes me feel best is get even. See, that's the thing that makes me feel best now. Not the idea that maybe in another lifetime, my great-grandchildren, of which I'm somebody's great-grandchild, if somebody had decided this, of which they were somebody's great-grandchild. You see what I'm saying? If the church had ever done, that church who had turned the whole world upside down, speaking, I'm sure of their geographical understanding of their area, but I mean the area in which they understood, but that church that had turned the whole world upside down within a generation of the resurrection of Jesus, if that church had persisted in looking to Jesus, considering him, then we might not be talking the way we're talking today. We might not be dealing with things like this today. Okay? I mean, I believe it with all my heart because I believe God's ways are true. I believe that when Jesus says something, he knows what he's talking about. And if there is no resemblance of that, no reflection of that on earth, it's our problem, not his. It's because we have refused to have faith in God. Be persuaded of his methods and means is what that means, have faith in God. Not just believe that there is a God, but be persuaded in his methods and means. I haven't been. I'm nearly 70 years old. I haven't been persuaded in his methods and means for 60 some of those years. I'm now persuaded. And you're already asking questions, and I'm not going to answer those questions. But what are you going to do if somebody... I don't want to hear that. I'm not telling you I'm prepared to deal with everything strictly from a godly perspective yet. But I tell you this, I can tell you for sure that the church isn't. The church worldwide is not. Some of the most hateful, ugly people I know write on Facebook, and I only have supposedly Christians that friend me on Facebook. Because I always look at somebody's, when they have a friend request, I see who they're friends with. I try to kind of discern a little bit what their interests are. And then I get them, and then I don't unfriend anybody because I figure, what the heck? They might as well hear what I have to say, and maybe they will. See? But I read their stuff, and I think, my God, these are some of the most ugly, nasty, mean people on the face of the earth. And they're all talking about their grace church they go to. Thank God we go to a grace church. Anyway. And so he goes on here, wanting us all to rather be healed than to persist in our insistence on get evenness, all right? He goes on and says, pursue peace with all people. Now, remembering context. In the context of what we've been reading, who are the people of context? The people of the context are the people who have sinned against you. They're the hostiles in our life. Isn't that right? It's no big deal to be at peace with those who are at peace with you. Jesus said the same thing. Even sinners do the same, right? So to pursue peace with all people, wow. So pursuing peace with all people is God's method of bringing wholeness to both the creation and the creature, right? Then he goes on and he says, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. We've got to be careful we don't package that in a Pentecostal holiness message. He's saying here that both through peace and holiness, pursuing peace and holiness, pursuing peace and pursuing holiness, he said, without which no one will see the Lord. We need to make sure we don't allow that also to be jerked out of context and become something that it's not meant to be. Because he's already told us in verses 1 through 4, specifically verses 2 and 3, what he means by pursue peace with all people. What was Jesus? What was the message of Jesus? The angels gave it. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, right? And what did he say? My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, give I unto you. See? Peace. And then peace be with you at the end. Peace to you if you forgive the sins of any. See? Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Isn't he right? Isn't that right? All right, so it says here, pursue peace and the holiness. So as I said to you last week, peace, it says, no one will see the Lord. Peace makes the Lord visible. Peace reveals the Lord. Isn't that right? See, the Lord, men see the Lord in peace, not in retribution and retaliation. So when we offer forgiveness, people don't necessarily know this, but when I offer forgiveness, some of you may have read in Brian's book. I think in Brian's book he brings out the how many of you have read any of that book of Brian's that I gave you? Okay, that I gave you, that you bought from me. See how easy us preachers turn things around? He talks about the Pope and that was shot and the man that shot him. I don't remember their names now. And how the Pope went and met him in prison and forgave him and met him face to face, and now that man calls him friend. Well, that man may be passed away by now too, but how they became friends. But you see, that man saw Jesus in the Pope coming to him. Now, we're going to talk next week about the fact forgiveness is not always about going to people. In fact, sometimes the best thing to do to forgive is to stay the hell away. See? I mean, really, you need to understand that. We'll talk about that more next week, probably. But, if you can forgive without confronting someone or being with them, and that many times is the safest way to forgive and the best way to go ahead and make sure your forgiveness has the result it's supposed to have. Because the first place that forgiveness needs to work, remember, is in you. You're the one who benefits the most by forgiveness. All right? But people see the Lord in forgiveness or peace. When you're making peace with somebody, one way or the other, they go see the Lord. Now, you may never talk to them, but they may recognize, that something has happened to you, that you're not pursuing them in a retaliatory way anymore. That you're not out there telling others how you wish they'd be run down by a truck. And they'll see the Lord. What has happened to Mike? That's not the same Mike I knew even last week. See what I'm saying? And they don't know it, but they're seeing the Lord. They're seeing the response of the Lord is what I'm trying to tell you. Okay? Now, so regardless, I just want you to get this, regardless of what your offended soul demands, and how many of us know that our offended soul makes demands upon us, right? So regardless of what your offended soul demands, Jesus is not in retaliation. Now, you want him to be, and I want him to be. There are times when I wish he was in my retaliation, because he has the means of carrying out the desires that I have for those who have transgressed against me. I don't have those means. I could never get away with it. I'd be in prison. So I want Jesus to be in my retaliation. I want him to be in my, but he's nowhere to be found. Yeah. So regardless of what my offended soul is demanding, whatever restitution my offended soul is demanding, I mean, it might be demanding restitution for somebody having broken your car window. You don't even know who it was. Well, whatever it is, Jesus ain't in that. I'm sorry. I truly wish I could tell you he was in there. Because he and I got some get even to do. Right? Okay. And then it goes on, and I want you to see this too. It says, men see the Lord in holiness. That's why for the first time in months, I have tucked in my shirt and buttoned it all the way to the top and worn a shirt with a collar. Because I wanted you to see the Lord today. You know? I tried to get Marilyn to put her hair up in a bun, but she didn't have enough left to put up in a bun, so she already cut it too short. No, see, and so this is the way men see the Lord. Well, when I abstain from this and I abstain from that and I declare this and I declare that, and of course I speak in King James English, you know, in talking to someone, when I picket, when I resist, right? That's how people see the Lord in my life of holiness. Again, not what this author was referring to at all. Because you see, the declaration of the Father is that we are all holy, blameless, and above reproach in His sight. All we church folks? No, all humanity. Because it was Jesus who became unto us these things, right? And so what this is telling us here is that men see the Lord, or that the Lord is revealed when all men are valued by us to be holy in the Lord. When we begin to value the holiness in others because of what Jesus did, not because they've come out of their jihad or their Muslim faith or their Buddhism or their Mormonism or their Baptistism or their Presbyterianism or whatever it is we think they need to come out of in order to be holy to the Lord. No, people see the Lord when we honor all men as holy. Well, I thought that would go over about like that. So this extended chastisement of the Lord simply says the world will continue to do what the world will do, and the world will continue to be what they think they are. Now remember, they aren't who they think they are. Just like most of us aren't, okay? Until they see the Lord. They'll continue to do what they do until they see the Lord. They'll continue to be who they think they are until they see the Lord. And who is it that has been given the ability to show them the Lord? We are the reflection of Jesus Christ, aren't we? That's what we're to be, is the reflection of Jesus Christ. He says, pursue peace with all men. How? Forgive again, right? Peace be unto you if you forgive. Forgive. What's that mean? Send away, dismiss. What am I to send away, dismiss? Well, according to Mark, if you have anything against anyone, forgive. He didn't even say sin. He said, if you have anything against anyone, send it away, dismiss it. In other words, what he's saying is, whatever does not agree with the Lord in your estimation of anyone, in your assessment of their actions, whatever does not agree with the Lord, you need to get rid of that right away. Because if you don't get rid of it right away, am I saying that your assessment, particularly their actions, is never correct? No, I'm not saying that. But he's saying if you have anything. So we can even go ahead so far and say, okay, you have, and he's maybe acknowledging that you have a valid something against someone. But he said, send it away, dismiss it. Right? Why? Because otherwise it's going to become a weight around your neck, and it's going to weight you right down into demanding vengeance, nullifying your influence. All right, then the last verse here that we're dealing with, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Well, lest anyone, let's keep this in context, okay? In particular, those designated others, them. These are the ones that he's referring to, lest anyone fall short of the grace. Now, certainly it applies to you and me too, because we're not functioning in the grace of God when we're not following this admonition. We're not flowing with the revelation of the grace of God. But what he's saying to us is, as Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, right? Why did he do that? For the joy set before him. What was the joy set before him? That the others who were inflicting him with hostilities and sin would be, what? Gathered in. Would experience the grace of God, would understand the grace of God. So they're the particular emphasis here, even though we're all included again, right? So lest anyone fall short of being identified and defined by the grace of God, is what he's saying. Lest anyone fall short of forgiveness. That's the grace of God, ultimately. Now, one of the words that Paul uses several times, and we'll refer to it in a later lesson, but one of the words that Paul uses, Jesus doesn't use it, but Paul does, it's translated forgive, is from the word charis, which means grace, and it indicates the gracious restoration and preservation of another. So that word actually talks about the preservation and restoration of another when you forgive. Even though, as I've said, forgiveness predominantly or primarily benefits me and you, say. This one word that Paul uses on several occasions is a word that refers to the gracious restoration and preservation of another. And then he goes on here and he says, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this, by what? By any root of bitterness, this, many become defiled. Now again, this isn't just about the isn't just about the designated other we've been talking about. Now, who is it that most often is first of all, the bearer of the root of bitterness? The unforgiving one, the one who has been transgressed against, right? That's where the root of bitterness usually has its beginnings. And yes, those people that we treat hatefully and ugly, they may become bitter against us but you know what? Again, they may not even know us. They may not even care. They may be gone, right? So the root of bitterness here has more to do with us, the ones to whom this admonition is being given, right? This root of bitterness. And this is one of my great, sadnesses right now, as I read of all of these people that are bad-mouthing the church on Facebook, all of these people who have left the church, many for good reasons. I want people to sit under some of the ministries they've sat under. But bad-mouthing, the misuse of the ministry, bitter towards pastors and teachers and the tithe message and a lot of things that we don't teach around here and a lot of things we don't agree with. But you say, I have no root of bitterness about those things. I mean, I probably do about some other things that that I'm not going to own up to right now. None of your business. But anyway, no. No, but I mean, I read this stuff and I read these things and I read about all of these people that have left the church en masse. And again, probably for most of them, I agree that they should have left where they were. But now they're out there bad-mouthing. They're putting pastors, for instance, in one lump. Everybody that is identified as a pastor is evil and bad and wants to control people, wants to be exercising ungodly authority over people, wants people to do what he says, wants women to be in submission to men in the church. I read things and I think, that's never been me. That couldn't be me. Right. And there's a lot of other people I know that it couldn't be too. And what is all this coming from? That root of bitterness. And that root of bitterness that is springing up in so many grace Christians, so many people that are vacating the church as quickly as they can, so many people that are bad-mouthing giving to the church. Hey, you know what? We don't talk about it much around here, but you know what? Giving keeps us going around here. We've loved to give ever since we got married and decided we'd like to give. We've never been compelled or what's the word, motivated by the tithe message or if you give, you get 100-fold return. We just gave. We considered ourselves blessed and we wanted to be a blessing to others. But there's people out there that have gotten so stingy and selfish in their root of bitterness that they are teaching people, don't give to the church, don't give to, you know what I mean? And it's interesting how so many of these that are doing that are itinerant ministries that want you to give to them so they can keep postulating their bullshit. What? We got rid of the jar. Write me a check. No. Did that sound bitter, that last word came out of my mouth? I'm sorry. But I'm serious. I'm sorry about it because it bothers us. We read things because we care about people. We care about the church. I believe in the church. As I've told several of my friends, I don't agree with all that stuff out there. I totally disagree with so much of the abuse that goes on in the church and so much lifting up of men and that kind of thing. I totally disagree with it. But I believe God has called Marilyn and I to try to make some repairs from the inside out. Not to stand on the outside, and I think there's people on the outside that are doing a wonderful job in restoring people's faith in Jesus and in the gospel, and I'm all for that too. I'm just not for the ones that are, I'm just not for the message coming from the ones that are allowing their bitterness to drive people away. And like one person said that I read this week, somebody's said that, it was a brother down in Florida that passed it. He said in response to somebody's post, you know, what you're doing is with this message is you're taking away every bit of, credibility from the church, to the degree that when these people who go away and start these small groups where all they do is sit around and complain about the church and everything, you know, that when those groups fall apart, we don't even become a viable alternative for them anymore. Because they've all been taught that the church is evil, the church is bad, see? And they're not really being taught that by the world. They're being taught that by people from within. You see what I'm saying? That's my soapbox. But I mean, I feel bad about it because, you know, I want the church to endure. The visible church. The community of the church. I mean, yeah, I don't give a flip about buildings and cathedrals and all that. I don't care about people being I don't want people being milk dry for their finances and stuff like that. But I want the community of the church and the coming together and the sharing of a common message that builds people up. And yes, I know that I'm almost a one-man show around here. That's not my desire. You're going to be more and more. That's why we invite so many people in, men and women alike. I want speaking here. I mean, it's not my intention to be a one-man show. It just happens to be working out that way right at this moment because of our numbers and because of, you know, who we all are together. But I want the church to endure. Yeah. I don't want the church to be gone when I die. Amen. I don't want Father's house to be gone when I die. See what I'm saying? I want to be able to stand with Jesus and look down and say, well, good, carry on. It's carrying on. See? So, as I said, this root of bitterness thing is a big thing with me right now because I'm realizing how bitter so many people are. Yeah, there are people who are expressing their bitterness against ISIS, and there are people who are expressing their bitterness against this political party and that political party, and none of that root of bitterness, any root of bitterness rising up defiles many, is what it says. Any root, not a specific root, not just the root that tickles Mike's fantasy, but any root of bitterness that grows up. See what I'm saying?